Hi, today I'm going to talk about navigating cloud security and third-party risk management. There's an expanding chasm in third-party risk management requiring a fundamental shift to zero-trust third-party risk management. So my name is Jeff Farinich. I have 25 years experience in IT and security, an MBA, various certifications. The last 5 years, I've been the SVP of IT and the CISO at New Market Funding, which is a national mortgage company in the United States and in a highly regulated industry. I've had various prior roles at Schools First Federal Credit Union, Cisco Systems, NDS, and other companies. Let me kind of review some recent news to set the stage. As you know, cybersecurity is really a very disruptive industry. Now, talk about the size of the economy for GDP. Cybercrime is third in the world, only following United States and China. Currently, this industry is sized around $9.5 trillion, expected to grow to over $10.5 trillion by the end of 2025. Now, this side of the economy continues to increase as the cyber damage worldwide just grows. And this is even before AI comes into account. So it's a big problem. Now, when we look at our third parties, let's first look at ourselves. I'm going to talk about what some CEOs responded about their own organization's capabilities. 60% of these CEOs said their organizations don't follow secure by design principles. 51% of these CEOs rank supply chain as a second highest external risk. 74% of these CEOs are concerned about how the organization can respond to avert or minimize damage from a cyber attack. 15% of all breaches involve a third party. Looking at the Global 2000, 99% of them experienced a vendor breach. 90% of all organizations have at least one third-party vendor that suffered breach. And this problem is compounding. Just in the last 2 years, the number of third-party breaches has nearly doubled. So if CEOs are that pessimistic about their own capabilities, we have to apply these same metrics to our vendors. And in most cases, our vendors may not be as well positioned as these larger organizations. So now I want to talk about vendor incidents the last 6 months, which have become very impactful and made the news. First of all, let's look at Change Healthcare back in February this year. It was the largest outage and breach in the industry for healthcare. It affected 110 million customers. It was an 11-day outage, and the cost expected to exceed $2.3 billion. Moving on, let's look at Snowflake in June. Snowflake did directly have a breach, but because it didn't require MFA enforcement, which its customers did enable, about 165 organizations were breached. Next, let's look at CDK Global in July. CDK Global provides supply chain services for about half the car dealers across the United States. This resulted in an 11-day outage. 15,000 dealers could not sell cars, could not apply for rebates for customers, and many other disruptive services. And this impacted 110 million customers at a cost of $1 billion. Also in July, CrowdStrike, the most notable incident we had. This was the infamous blue screen of death that affected nearly all CrowdStrike customers to some degree. Now, this was not a breach. It was not an outage caused by a threat actor. It was CrowdStrike's own doing and due a faulty update to its sensors. And last, let's talk about Microsoft, who's had multiple outages this year with Azure. The last one being in July 30th, there was a DDoS attack. And through their mitigation efforts, it actually resulted in a 10-day global outage. So as we look at our vendors, we're understanding that these large vendors are so critical to supply chain, we have to start considering how do we measure systematic risk with our critical vendors. A normal evaluation process for organizations is pretty much as follows. We look at the attack surface, which are all assets available on the internet. We look at security rating scores, which is also the results of these assets that were scanned. This continues into trust and security pages that shows all the certifications and attestations these vendors have. We also do various forms of questionnaires as well as other evidence of artifacts. So I'm looking at ways on how to enhance this evaluation process. And here are some ways that I've done my program. Let's start with questionnaires. So I'm looking at what's the qualification of CISO, years of experience, certifications, education, and many other factors to understand who the CISO is and how qualified they are. Also like to look at what's the qualification of the security department, the size, the structure, even education certification. Also, what functional departments are reporting to the CISO? It's very important to understand, does the CISO have a lot of authority and control throughout his direct organization, or is a lot more influence control, which a lot of times can be hard to make progress? And lastly, for the CISO is, who does the CISO report to? Ideally, I'm going to see the CEO, the president, the chief operating officer. Those are all the preferred reporting structures. So moving beyond the CISO, let's talk about reviewing system design architecture. I've had vendors who provide critical services for encryption only find out years down the road that they've had a major network outage because their network architecture had resiliency design flaws. Another case is bug bounty methodology. I had another vendor who a researcher tried to report numerous times to the vendor who provided critical privileged access management services, but they weren't able to get through to submit their bug. That resulted in the researcher to going public with the finding. So it's very important to understand how easy does your vendor allow bugs to be reported. Let's talk about what are some minimum baselines to look at when you're reviewing a vendor. Sometimes vendors are smaller, you can't do as thorough of an evaluation, but in this case, these baselines are used for every vendor at a minimum. And these controls here are really what's required for insurability, for cyber insurance. So let's start MFA for remote access and privileged access, endpoint protection and response capabilities, having secure, encrypted, and tested backups, having privileged access management, having email and web filtering controls, having a strong program around vulnerability and patch management, having a well-defined policy around cyber incident planning and testing, looking at how the vendor conducts cyber awareness training and phishing testing for its users, reviewing the system hardening capabilities, including is RDP enabled or disabled, making sure there's logging and network protections in place, understanding how a vendor has dealt with end-of-life systems, which in many cases they may have still, but that's okay. But then what are the competent controls to protect those systems? And lastly, every vendor should have some level of vendor and digital supply chain risk management in their program to evaluate their vendors, which in my case would be fourth party risk or beyond. Let's dive deeper now to posture management. I'm starting to ask vendors about what APIs do they know about, but I'm also looking at which APIs they don't know about. That's referred to as shadow APIs. So there's now tools that allow you to scan for shadow APIs. Also looking at posture management for cloud. These are CSPM tools like Wiz and Orca and many others. Looking at identity security posture management, like how is Okta ping Enter ID configured, making sure it's kind of hardened with the most strongest settings enabled. A new area to look at is non-human identities, which I'll talk about on another slide. That's a whole new attack surface. And lastly, keep in mind, what other posture management checks can you do on these vendors? Now let's move from posture to detection response. So I'm in these same categories. What does a vendor have to detect and respond to any kind of notable events? So once again, for APIs, for the cloud, for identity, for non-human identity, as well as anything else. So I'm going to dive deeper now and talk about detection response with cloud. In this case, how is the cloud configured to detect events? In this case, mapping to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. As you'll see on the left, CSPM tools like Wiz, Orca, and others, they really focus on identify and protect. Now, they're trying to move more into detect and respond, but that's kind of a new area for them. So it's very important to make sure, ask your vendor, besides getting a posture score from CSPM, ask your vendor, I want to see how are you scoring for cloud detection response capabilities to really detect those threats. Because in most cases, a breach in the cloud has a dwell time of several weeks to even several months. So this allows you to really track the attack in those clouds to make sure you can understand, does a vendor have this visibility? How are they mapping to the services heat map? And most of all, can they respond and recover from this kind of attack? So here's a dashboard from a vendor that shows their readiness score for MITRE. It shows the MITRE ATT&CK coverage, where they're strong versus weak, and really gives you an idea of which logs percentages they're missing versus having enabled. Moving on next to really non-human identities. So most vendors have a fairly good program around human identities. They have their IDP in place to authenticate users. If they're more mature, they'll have identity and governance administration to help with the automation for the life cycle of that user. But what about non-human identities? This is a whole new area, really, that's a big problem in cloud. In most cases, non-human identities can exceed human identities by a factor of several X. In my case, it's about 4 times the size. There's been multiple breaches from Mercedes-Benz to several other companies where one non-human identity has caused a breach of a lot of PI, design and trade secrets, and other sensitive data you don't want to have exposed. So it's very important. Ask your vendor, what is their NHI governance program? So the key takeaways really are, never trust your vendor has it covered. These questions I'm asking now for vendors, they're difficult because vendors aren't used to being asked this. But given the situation where vendors have major outages, they have breaches, there's lack of confidence in organizations, which vendors definitely are part of, ask the difficult questions and demand the proof. In the end, both you and the vendor will be much better off. Thank you.